Hello everyone, Inhuman Form here. I've got a special announcement that relates to this video at the very end, so stick around for that, and remember to like this video. On November 3rd, 1986, after an information leak in Iran, a little-known Lebanese newspaper received an interesting piece of information that would shock the entire world. The leak claimed that the United States had engaged in a secret arms deal with Iran in an effort to free American hostages being held captive in Lebanon. These allegations were serious because the United States was barred from dealing weapons to Iran due to an international arms embargo. The magazine immediately published an article releasing the information to the public, and 10 days later, President Ronald Reagan would have to address the nation from the Oval Office about the growing scandal that faced him and his administration. A scandal that would become known as the Iran Contra Affair.
As Will Rogers once said, rumor travels faster, but it don't stay put as long as truth. So let's get to the facts.
The Iran-Contra scandal had two dimensions in two areas that seemingly had no connection. One in Nicaragua, one in the Middle East. During the 1980s, Lebanon was ravaged by a brutal civil war between factions who were vying for control over the country. During this time, the kidnapping of foreign nationals was common, especially with Hezbollah, an Iranian-sponsored Islamist organization, which caused the US to engage in an arms embargo against Iran called Operation Staunch. Meanwhile, Iran was waging its own bloody 8-year war against Iraq, a beneficial ally of the United States at the time. But they urgently needed modern equipment to continue the fight.
The Soviet Union had just made a massive arms deal with Iraq and was pouring large quantities of the most modern equipment into Iraq. It already had an arms arrangement with Syria. In some way, these forces had to be counterbalanced.
Despite the embargo, Iran made a secret request to purchase weapons from the United States. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane sought Reagan's approval of the illegal sale of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to Iran, claiming that the sale would not only bolster the United States' influence on Iran, but might improve relations with Lebanon, increasing the United States' presence within the Middle East. But Reagan was under the spell of an obsession that was too powerful to resist. He had become fixated on his failure to secure the release of 7 American hostages that were being held in Lebanon by Hezbollah. Reagan often met with families of the American hostages who were kidnapped, but publicly refused to bargain with terrorists or to aid Iran in its war against Iraq.
The United States gives terrorists no rewards and no guarantees. We make no concessions, we make no deals.
But when the opportunity to release the hostages had come to light, he began to convince himself that he was not negotiating with terrorists. U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger wrote in his notes that President Reagan said he could answer to charges of lawlessness, but he couldn't answer to charges that big, strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free American hostages. 13 days after Reagan denounced negotiations with Iran, McFarlane visited him in the hospital while the president was recovering from surgery to remove a cancerous growth in his colon. Reagan had endured a deal of psychological trauma from this life-threatening cancer, which many claim, along with the anesthesia from surgery, could have impaired his judgment during the meeting. Nevertheless, McFarlane continued, outlining their recently planned arms for hostages deal with Iran. Iran would receive anti-tank missiles through Israel in exchange for an undetermined number of American hostages and renewed communications with Iran. Till this day, no one is exactly sure of what took place and what was agreed upon during this meeting. But in a complex series of events and a number of private loans, the illegal sale of arms to Iran through Israel began less than a month later. McFarlane brought on a key figure into this operation, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who was tasked with managing the logistics in the interest of the United States in the highly secretive arms deal. Oliver North would play a major role in what would soon take place. For many years, even before his presidency, Reagan had a deep-seated hatred for communism and anything related to the Soviet Union. It had become an obsession for him, and that was made very clear by his foreign policy decisions. Reagan had vowed to wipe out communism and put an end to the Cold War, and he would do this by any means necessary. Far from Iran on the other side of the world, the Reagan administration, with the help of the CIA, were involved in covert actions against the leftist Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. One of the biggest questions that arises when covering the Iran Contra scandal is why the United States were so concerned with a tiny country that in no way posed a threat to their safety. In 1979, Nicaraguan leftists, the Sandinistas, overthrew a longtime US ally, the ruling Somoza family, and formed their own government, which created some of the most effective social reforms in the hemisphere at the time, that were praised by organizations like the World Bank and Oxfam as an outstanding example of participatory democracy. Despite the country's lack of abundance in resources, reforms in the early 80s provided a steadily increasing quality of life for its people. The award-winning Nicaraguan literacy campaign, introduced in 1980, dropped public illiteracy in Nicaragua almost entirely, reducing it from 50.3% to 12.9%. The Sandinistas were also able to provide Nicaragua with a national healthcare system that reached the majority of its citizens, reducing mortality by approximately half despite an ongoing war. This posed a unique threat to the Reagan administration, the threat of a good example. If a poorer and weaker country could provide a better life for its population than a country with more money and more resources, people would start asking questions. When people start asking questions, it's not good for business.
On the reports of what went on in Cambodia.
Can you give an example?
Yes, your article.
In his book, What Uncle Sam Really Wants, world-renowned scholar and leading critic of U.S. foreign policy, Noam Chomsky, states, "As far as American business is concerned, Nicaragua could disappear and nobody would notice. If you want a global system that's subordinated to the needs of U.S. investors, you can't let pieces of it wander off." In addition to this reality, their involvement with the Soviet Union and Cuba and their support for socialist reforms sounded alarms for Reagan to take action against the Sandinistas. He saw them as a communist puppet state under the control of the Soviet Union. In a classic example of unchecked abuse of presidential power, the Reagan administration and the CIA began funding the Contras, a disparate group of counter-revolutionaries who opposed the Sandinistas. But much like the arms embargo against Iran, Congress had prohibited the funding of the Contras with the Boland Amendment, a series of acts that were passed as a means of preventing Reagan's aggressive attempts at interfering with the state affairs of Nicaragua. The Reagan administration went as far as the use of propaganda to influence public and congressional opinion prior to the decision of whether or not the US should be funding the Contras, but the attempt failed. But by the time Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, the Reagan administration had already committed itself to fully supporting the Contras unconditionally, at any cost.
Mr. President, why don't we openly support those 7,000 guerrillas that are in rebellion against it rather than giving aid through covert activity?
Why, because we want to keep on obeying the laws of our country, which we are obeying.
I can follow up, sir.
Doesn't the United States want that government replaced?
No, because that would be violating the law.
But, Mr. President, what is the American public to think? you're having an action, a good example of totalitarianism, that is to ensure that the
I'm
opposition...
the first one that stopped your monopoly on misinformation.
The idea that I have a monopoly of misinformation in the American press is a little ridiculous.
No,
Let me really, I control the American press? Let me repeat, let's go back to the facts. Now, if we had the slightest concern with democracy, which we do not in our foreign affairs and never have, we would turn to countries where we have influence, like El Salvador. Now, in El Salvador, they don't call the archbishop bad names. What they do is murder him. They do not censor the press. They wipe the press out. They sent the army in to blow up the church radio station. The editor of the independent newspaper was found in a ditch, mutilated and cut to pieces with machete. May I continue? I did not interrupt you.
Don't you ever want to put a time value on anything you say.
Covert defiance had now become the executive branch's modus operandi. They began supplying the Contras with arms, equipment, and money, putting faith in the belief that illegal covert activities would put an end to the regime, a strategy that had proven time and again to only raise tensions and body count, much like Vietnam during the 60s and the 70s.
If, in fact, they have been trying to circumvent the will of Congress and provide aid notwithstanding that, that seems to me to be a very serious infraction. It's a constitutional violation. It's an infringement on the stated law of this country, if you will.
While the Reagan administration and fellow conservatives celebrated them, the Contras were routinely condemned by human rights groups for indiscriminately killing civilians. Washington would send money and equipment, and the CIA would coordinate training programs, deliver intelligence, and provide target lists for the Contras, who were made up of National Guardsmen, ex-Sandinista soldiers, and farmers who opposed the new Sandinista regime. They proved to be an extremely violent group, murdering civilians and Sandinista officials, as well as nurses, doctors, and judges, in a brutal manner. A manual provided by the CIA instructed the Contras to incite shame, ridicule, and humiliate the Sandinista officials to reduce their influence, and incite mob violence in health clinics, schools, and other public areas. The war crimes of the Contras were some of the worst in United States history and were noted by multiple human rights groups.
The call can be made as soon as you pick up that signal and tell them to ring the call to.
After Congress prohibited Reagan from providing the Contras with federal funding through the Boland Amendment, the Americans sought out alternative ways to fund the Contras by raising money through foreign allies and private funding. When private funding and third-party governments did not provide as much support as Oliver North wanted for the Contras, he came upon the idea of overcharging the Iranians for the weapons that they sold them, and using the surplus to fund the Contras. North wrote a memo to Reagan stating that $12 million of the profit made from the illegal arms deal with Iran would, quote, be used to purchase critically needed supplies for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance Forces. This controversial scheme would once again reveal the Machiavellian nature of Reagan and his cronies. 3 months later, Reagan was forced to admit that his administration had in fact sold weapons to free the hostages. He claimed that he did not personally allow any of these things, but he had to take full responsibility as president. Investigations and allegations ensued. Oliver North appeared before Congress to testify his role in the scandal in a dramatized display of political theater. He likened the Iran Contra hearings to a baseball game in which Congress was both a player and a referee.
I did do it. I am not, as I said in my statement, at all ashamed of any of the things that I did. I was given a mission, and I tried to carry it out.
But part of that mission was to shield the others who were giving you the orders.
That is the part of any subordinate. I never called myself a hero. Those words were used by other people to describe me. I am grateful for those words, but I've never called myself such.
Colonel, 5.5 years in the White House hasn't destroyed those values.
Not at all.
Nor has this investigation destroyed those values.
Not in the least.
North claimed that his superiors approved his actions, and Reagan had personally approved the diversion of profit from the Iran arms sales to the Contras. In a paranoid fashion, he believed his actions were justified by his and the administration's desire to eradicate their greatest fear, the looming specter of communism. A fear that had already been the justification for multiple wars. A jury found North guilty of obstruction of congressional inquiries, destroying NSC documents, and receiving illegal gratuity. North received 2 years probation, $150,000 in fines, and 1,200 hours community service for his war crimes, but was eventually pardoned by George Bush Sr. Other members of the Reagan administration similarly avoided punishment. John Poindexter, North's superior, was convicted on several charges, but his conviction was overturned due to his immunized testimony. Secretary of Defense Weinberger had been accused of perjury and obstruction of justice, but also received a pardon from George Bush. Reagan's popularity was temporarily affected, but his rating recovered after he left office due to a post-presidency propaganda campaign that has successfully altered the public's perception of him and has deified him as a champion of conservatism among the American right wing. Prosecutors and congressional bodies have spent years researching the facts, but much of the evidence has been destroyed. In the end, only one participant, former CIA agent Thomas Clines, served time in prison. The others were all acquitted or pardoned by George Bush for technical reasons. In many ways, we still live with the consequences of Iran Contra. It is an interesting event to examine with the aim of getting a better look inside the corridors of power and to better understand the psychology behind political corruption. Thanks for watching. Remember to hit subscribe and like the video. Now for my special announcement. I know that you probably saw Noam Chomsky in this video a couple times, and I referenced his book as well. I kind of did that on purpose because a week and a half from the point that I post this video, I will be interviewing Professor Noam Chomsky, and that'll be on my podcast, which I will leave the link for in the description below, and potentially we'll put some of that footage on this channel. So remember to hit subscribe. Thank you very much.